Welcome to this explainer on Reg Area 2, focusing strictly on business law, and specifically agency authority, duties, and liability. We're going to keep this highly focused and jump right in. Agency questions on REG test whether one person can legally act for another person. The main skill is identifying the principal, the agent, the third party, the type of authority, and who is bound or liable when the agent acts. That is the core framework right there. Every single scenario you're going to encounter on the exam ultimately traces back to these fundamental elements. Understanding the mechanics of these relationships isn't just helpful, it's absolutely essential for navigating scenario-based questions. We're going to break down exactly how these relationships function and, crucially, how they actually get tested. Okay, let's dive into this. Think of the 6 questions on your screen as your algorithmic checklist for tackling literally any multiple-choice scenario on this topic. When you read a fact pattern, you want to systematically ask yourself, was an agency relationship even created in the first place? If it was, what exact authority did the agent have? Based on that authority, is the principal now bound to a contract? Or wait, is the agent personally liable? And finally, did the agent or principal breach a duty? And what's the legal consequence of that breach? If you train yourself to run through this specific checklist, you'll be able to dismantle even the most complex questions they throw at you. So let's start with the absolute foundation, the agency relationship itself. This relationship exists when one person, the agent, acts on behalf of another person, the principal. The critical components here are mutual consent and control. The principal has to have the capacity to give legal consent, and they must maintain some level of control over what the agent does. The agent then goes out and interacts with a third party on the principal's behalf. It's a three-way dynamic, almost like a triangle. And identifying exactly who sits at each corner of that triangle is your very first step in analyzing any scenario. Once you establish that an agency relationship actually exists, the immediate next question is about authority. Basically, how does an agent actually get the power to bind a principal? Well, there are 3 main paths we need to care about. First, there's actual authority, which we break down further into express and implied. Second, there's apparent authority. And third, there's a really interesting concept called ratification. On the exam, they're typically going to present a scenario and ask if the principal is bound by what the agent just did. To answer that correctly, you have to determine which of these distinct paths of authority, if any, is in play. Let's clearly contrast the first 2, because honestly, mixing these up is a very common trap. Actual authority is all about the internal relationship between the principal and the agent. It comes directly from the principal's words or conduct directed specifically toward the agent. If I explicitly tell you, hey, go buy me a company car, that is express actual authority. Implied actual authority simply means you also have the power to do what's reasonably necessary to carry out that express command. But apparent authority? That's a whole different ballgame. It has absolutely nothing to do with what the principal secretly tells the agent. It is entirely based on the principal's conduct toward the third party. If a principal acts in a way that leads a third party to reasonably believe the agent has authority, the principal can be bound, even if the agent had 0 real authority. The absolute key phrase to remember here is the third party's reasonable belief based on the principal's actions. Let's move to our third path and see how this builds, the ratification process. This is a fascinating concept because authority is essentially granted after the fact. Picture this timeline. Step 1, the agent acts completely without authority. Maybe they go rogue and sign a contract they had absolutely no right to sign. Step 2, the principal finds out about the unauthorized transaction, but instead of rejecting it, they actually accept or approve it. Maybe it turns out to be a great deal for them. Then comes step 3. Because of that approval, the principal now becomes bound by the contract, exactly as if the agent had actual authority from the very beginning. So ratification retroactively authorizes the act. Now that we understand how authority works, let's look at the obligations within the relationship, starting with the duties of agents. Agents are fiduciaries. That means they are held to a very high legal standard. They must act exclusively in the principal's best interest. Let's break down their core duties. Loyalty means absolutely no conflicts of interest and definitely no secret profits. Care and skill means they've got to act with reasonable competence. Obedience requires following all lawful, reasonable instructions from the principal. Accounting means keeping the principal's funds totally separate from their own, so no commingling of money whatsoever. And finally, notification, or the duty to inform, means the agent must tell the principal anything relevant they learn while doing their job. A breach of any of these isn't just bad form. It means the agent can be held personally liable to the principal for damages. But hey, the relationship goes both ways, right? Let's flip the focus to the duties of principals. While the agent has those strict fiduciary duties, the principal has practical contractual duties. They must compensate the agent, assuming payment was agreed upon beforehand. They must reimburse the agent for any reasonable expenses incurred while carrying out their authorized duties. They owe a duty of cooperation, meaning they literally cannot actively hinder the agent from doing their job. And importantly, they owe a duty of indemnification at a high level. This simply means if the agent incurs a loss or liability while faithfully executing the principal's specific instructions, the principal has to step up and cover that loss. Exam scenarios love to test these by showing a principal stubbornly refusing to pay a perfectly legitimate expense. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how liability shifts when a contract is signed, which is a heavily tested area. This breaks down who the third party can actually sue based on how much they knew about the principal. If the principal is disclosed, meaning the third party knows the agent is acting for a principal and knows exactly who that principal is, then only the principal is liable on the contract, assuming the act was authorized. The agent basically steps out of the picture entirely. But if the principal is partially disclosed, meaning the third party knows there is a principal but doesn't know their identity, or undisclosed, meaning the third party thinks they're just doing business directly with the agent, then the liability expands. In those specific cases, the third party can hold either the principal or the agent liable. The exam frequently asks who the third party can hold bound when an agent signs a contract for a secret buyer, so keep this distinction locked in. Let's apply these concepts with a practical scenario. Imagine an office manager who routinely orders supplies on the company account. Eventually, the company changes the manager's role but totally forgets to revoke this purchasing power. The manager then goes ahead and signs a new contract with a longtime vendor. Is the company bound? Yes, for sure. Why? Apparent authority. The company's past conduct of routinely paying this vendor for the manager's orders created a very reasonable belief in the vendor's mind that the manager still had authority. Because the company never bothered to notify the vendor that the authority was revoked, the principal's inaction maintained that apparent authority. Therefore, the principal is firmly bound by the contract. Now let's look at another common scenario. A warehouse worker who has absolutely no authority to sign contracts goes ahead and signs a lease for a shiny new forklift. The warehouse owner finds out, looks at the lease, realizes it's actually a fantastic price, and simply signs the first payment check to the leasing company. So what just happened here? This is a textbook illustration of ratification. Originally, there was no actual or apparent authority. The worker went completely rogue. However, by accepting the benefits of the transaction and signing that check, the owner ratified the unauthorized act. Because of that subsequent approval, the owner is now fully bound to the lease just as if they had authorized it from day one. So, the crucial point is knowing where candidates usually stumble. Here are the most common exam traps you absolutely need to avoid. First, confusing actual authority with apparent authority. Remember the rule. Actual is what the principal tells the agent. Apparent is what the principal's conduct tells the third party. Second, do not look at the agent's statements to determine apparent authority. An agent cannot create their own apparent authority by just claiming they're in charge. It literally must stem from the principal's conduct. Third, don't miss ratification. Always check if the principal later approved an unauthorized act. Fourth, never assume the agent is completely immune to liability. If the principal is undisclosed, the agent is on the hook. Fifth, pay close attention to whether the principal's identity was disclosed to the third party. And finally, keep agency liability distinct from general business owner liability. Focus strictly on the rules of agency we've discussed today. We'll wrap up this explainer by leaving you with your mental algorithm for exam day. Keep practicing those scenarios, focus heavily on the principal's conduct, and remember this exact takeaway. Agency questions become easier when you identify the principal, agent, and third party, then determine the type of authority, whether the principal is bound, whether the agent is liable, and whether any duty was breached.